Hello and welcome! Today I would like to talk about one of the greatest people of the last century, Tomas Garrigue Masaryk, the first president of Czechoslovakia. His fellow citizens gratefully named him President Liberator. This man is an example of how even just one person can make a difference. He is proof that if one stands behind his opinion and does not step down even when everything is against him, he can eventually win. Masaryk was born in 1850 in Moravia, which was part of the old Bohemian kingdom. It was then part of the Habsburg monarchy, which ruled over many unfree nations. The ruling class consisted of the Austrians and the Germans, which controlled the other nations, Czechs and their relatives, Slovaks, Hungarians, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Ruthenians, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, etc. Masaryk's family came from very humble beginnings. His father served as a stable hand on a farm which belonged to the local authorities. On the hill above the village there was a castle which originally belonged to the Temple order and last to the Jesuits. Around the time of Masaryk's birth, the manor already belonged to the local secular nobility, officials of the imperial court. Those officials served Thomas's dad. During his long life, Masaryk often recalled his experience with them. "I've often seen how those officers were rude and arrogant towards my father. How many times I speculated on how to reciprocate. When the gentry stopped by for a hunt, they left their coats at our house. After I had such desire to pour out my anger onto those coats. After the hunt, the gentry dined in the forester's lodge, throwing residues of their feast to the servants who fought over them. I crawled to the stables in humiliation and anger." Sometimes he debated with a young stableman in the barn. The young man had just returned from the war, from the great world, and he was so confused that he did not know even for whose side he had fought. One day, little Thomas found this 20-year-old veteran on the doorsteps. The young man had hung himself on a leash. This suicide scarred Masaryk for life. When he reached his 14th year, his parents sent him to high school in the Moravian capital city of Brno. From that time on, he had to take care of himself. What did he carry in his soul? So far, the only things he had known were slavery, servitude, and injustice. A dynamic in which one has everything and the other nothing. He had become accustomed to the habit of looking at the world from below. He had a sharpened sense for injustice and at the same time a sense for personal dignity and freedom. He recognized the gentry, though located in the Czech lands, were mostly German-speaking and that the subjects spoke Czech. His national and social experiences were identical. The German grammar school in Brno, even though they didn't teach in Czech, opened up the wide world of education to him. But how is it that he didn't get good grades? The school constrained him, so he became self-taught. The professor of Greek and Latin was a German chauvinist who pronounced the ancient Greek text the German way. For example, the word Zeus read Zeus. Masaryk decided to read Latin the Czech way, which earned him a lower grade in behavior. A far worse incident occurred later, when he refused to participate in the obligatory confession. He argued to the catechist that the confession is not mentioned anywhere in the Bible, and that in his opinion it is just a silly idea. A man can commit iniquity, confess, get 3 Hail Marys, and can happily continue to sin. Profane Masaryk was presented to the director, who told him, "Listen, I also don't believe this nonsense, but as I am an office bearer, I have to act according to the instructions." To which the student responded very presumptuously, "Whoever acts contrary to their belief is a scoundrel." The director launched at him, but Masaryk jumped to the stove, grabbed the fire hook, and stood up in defense, for which he was expelled from school. Fortunately, at that time, he was already well inscribed in the family of Police President Lemonnier, where he was recommended to help out with teaching the son. So when he came to say goodbye to Lemonnier, the chief of police told him that he had been transferred to Vienna and had been appointed chief of police in the capital city of the whole monarchy, and even ennobled. he offered to take Masaryk to Vienna with him. The journey from Brno to Vienna marked the transition from the suburbs to the city of cities, to imperial metropolis, to the center which was marked by the European spirit, which was just undergoing a generous construction. The ring was growing, and around it grew lanes of palaces, including the imperial burg, museums, city hall, the opera, and the parliament. Vienna lived by the pomp of the imperial court. Saloons of the rich epitomized highly inspirational centers. The Viennese elite assembled there, politicians, scientists, and artists. Masaryk thus recognized two forms of life, poor and wealthy. He absorbed both but identified with neither. Soon he graduated and entered the University of Vienna. During his university studies, he started thinking about the Czech question too. After all that time, over 140,000 Czechs lived in Vienna. Usually, only the low-class positions were left for them. They served as laborers, craftsmen, maids, journeymen, and ordinary soldiers. He therefore decided to draw up an action program for Czechs. Once he passed the doctorate, he wrote a series of 9 articles titled Theory and Practice. In it, he developed his own ideas about politics, which had to be backed up by morality. The efforts of national equality and the general progress mainly rested on the sciences, enlightenment, and education. Masaryk's patron, Dr. Schlesinger, decided to pay for his further studies, so he moved to the best European university at that time, in Leipzig, Germany. In this city, Masaryk became acquainted with the world of Protestantism. Germany then went through a huge growth. The university was a highly inspiring setting. Masaryk immediately engaged in philosophical debates and competitions. But the main thing that happened here was in his private sphere. There he met a young girl named Charlotte Garrigue, who came from America for a brief visit to see her friend. Masaryk was enchanted by her. She was educated, not only in music, but as he said, she was able to repair Goethe with Shakespeare. In her Unitarian faith he found religion for every day, service to one's neighbor and responsibility for the world. Once the whole company rode on a trip, but there was an accident. While getting off of the boat, the landlady, a full-bodied elderly lady, in whose house Masaryk lived, fell into the water and began to drown. Masaryk jumped for her, but she pulled him into the deep, and they almost drowned together. But he braced himself with tremendous strength and pulled her to shore. He lost consciousness. When he awoke, he found that Charlotte was leaning over him. Then, however, she announced that she had to say goodbye and left for the rest of her stay to a nearby spa. Masaryk immediately sent her a letter in which he offered marriage. She responded with the reservation that she couldn't match the high standards of marriage with him. He went to her. They spent hours arguing excitedly. Masaryk realized that Charlotte would have to say goodbye to her family. She came from a wealthy, almost aristocratic American family. He was the son of a groom from a house with the floor made of beaten dirt. Charlotte would have to leave her homeland, democratic, progressive America, and stay with him in an uncertain Europe. Of course he was attracted to the fact that his life would gain another dimension with her. Charlotte represented the new world. He insisted, and she finally confessed the real reason for her reluctance. In her soul there were occasional flushes of melancholy and depression, which was a family malady. But Masaryk, a young man and loved, brushed it aside. As he was able to pull someone out of the water, he reasoned, he would be able to pull a beloved person from depression. This was an error. However, they agreed, and he quickly began to work on his habilitation thesis, thereby becoming a docent and finally able to feed a family. The wedding would take place 1 year later. Charlotte returned to New York, and he returned to Vienna. To secure a place as a university teacher, Masaryk presented a study on suicide. It was a topic that had perplexed him his whole life, and not only as an individual phenomenon. At the time, Masaryk was working on the file, 50,000 suicides occurred each year in Europe. Then he received a telegram from America that Charlotte had been injured in a traffic accident and her body had been paralyzed. With the last of his money, he bought a boat ticket and promptly sailed to New York. It was a very dramatic trip. One night of detonation went off and water began to flood the cabins. Everybody started to panic. Masaryk was amazed by the idea. Instead of a wedding bed, a wet grave awaited him. Fortunately, it turned out that only the tank with drinking water had cracked, and so, after 17 days, nearly dying of thirst, they arrived to Manhattan. Charlotte had meanwhile sufficiently recovered from her injuries and shock, and was waiting for Thomas at the harbor. Within a month, the wedding took place. On the marriage contract he first signed, in deference to Charlotte, with his wife's name, Tomas Garrigue Masaryk. It was a rare thing during the second half of the 19th century to take the wife's name. Masaryk found himself at a crossroads. Until that time, his life could be described as a period of preparation during which he studied. Now it was time for him to give back and proceed with the task for society. Of course, he behaved like a Czech, but also felt like a citizen of the world. His decision was not easy. He knew that the big world was waiting to offer him great chances. Just how painful his decision-making was is seen from a letter of his at that time. I dislike the dank province of the Austrian monarchy, so I am preparing for a long journey, forever, to America. My spirit atrophies without freedom, and there is nothing more than different forms of slavery, in society, in the church, the state, everywhere. It seems that his wife Charlotte played an important role in the solution to the dilemma in his homeland and the world. She professed that Providence had set a plan for each nation and each man, and it was recommended to comply with said plan. Convinced that her husband was endowed with an impersonal mission, she told him to work where it was most difficult, where it was most needed, that is, home among the Czechs. She acted like Ruth from the Old Testament. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Together, they permanently relocated to Prague, the capital city of Bohemia, or the Czech lands. Both were strangers in Prague, foreigners. At that time, the main Czech university, founded in the 14th century by the Czech king and Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, was finally restored in Prague. Lectures took place in primitive conditions. Instead of having the first lecture in a classroom, Professor Masaryk went to buy a cabinet with the students so that he could store textbooks. He drew up a plan of scientific and interpretation activities. He also co-founded the magazine Athenaeum, in order to acquaint the Czech community with all the news of European science and culture. Masaryk and his wife Charlotte used a house on Bethlehem Square, close to Bethlehem Chapel, as a center, and quickly adapted it to the new academic environment. This is the same place where Jan Hus preached against the shameful behaviors of the prelates of the church in the 15th century.
Nešťastným bohatstvím, v němž církev tone, zjedovatělo a otráveno jest veškeré křesťanstvo na duši. Odkud svárové mezi papeži, preláty, biskupy a ostatními kněžími? Psi oko se hryžou, vezmi kost a přestanou. Vezměte prelátům, biskupům a ostatním kněžím peníze, bohatství, majetek, světské panování a rázem se přestanou drát o místa, podplácet, přeplácet hodnosti. I svárové mezi papeži přestanou. Pamatujte si jedno, ať je to prostý kněz, biskup, anebo sám papež, pokud žijí v hříchu, nejsou z milosti Boží.
This was 100 years before Martin Luther and the German Reformation. Huss was condemned by the church and was burned as a heretic. Masaryk and his wife lived in a house nearby the famous chapel and gathered the so-called Americans, the Prague academic elite who were inspired by the ideals of American freedom and democracy. The American Club of Ladies was also established, which Charlotte quickly joined. Masaryk used to say that, on the women's issue, he was only the interpreter of his wife's ideas. Opinions about a woman were studied by the living model of my wife. She had and has the most influence on the development of my viewpoints and my character. Masaryk confessed that woman is neither worse nor better, but is different from a man and has to be herself. And it is not good to pit man and woman against each other, for only man and woman together are whole. Another significant aspect that both spouses attached to the Bohemian spirit was the music of Czech composer Bedřich Smetana. They attended several premieres of his operas. They heard the premiere of My Homeland, where they saw Smetana, who, already deaf, was waving a white scarf from the gallery to the audience. Masaryk and Charlotte attended the opening of the National Theatre together. It was at the National Theatre that Masaryk first expressed his enthusiastic approval of the Czech nation, as well as the belief that the Czech nation was characterized by qualities which entitled it to confidently equal any nation in modern Europe. After all, this wonderful, unique theater was built from the collections of common people, from small donations, coin after coin. And it ultimately had to be erected twice, as the building burned to the ground not long after its initial construction. Masaryk shocked the public when he ignited the so-called fight for manuscripts. At the beginning of the 19th century, ancient parchments with epic poems about Czech antiquity were allegedly discovered. After such, Czech national spirit rose dramatically. But Masaryk couldn't ignore the voices of some foreign and domestic scientists who doubted whether they were fake documents, forgeries. Masaryk asked himself a question involving moral character: whether or not to build the future of a nation on a lie. He knew that if he opened this problem, a very delicate situation would ensue. The discussion of the scientists was soon transferred to journalists in the daily press, which triggered public passions and eventually slid into the pubs where crowds debated the authenticity of the manuscripts. Mainly, though, it sparked a huge manhunt against Masaryk, and it followed him everywhere, even to his own villa. The Masaryk family lived on the second floor, and the owner of the villa, an opponent of Masaryk and supporter of the authenticity of the manuscripts, lived on the first floor. Perhaps the most devastating to Masaryk was that his colleagues were intimidated into silence. He was accused of corrupting the youth, and that he was a philosopher of national suicide. As if that weren't enough, he also discovered an ongoing denunciation campaign against him, including several attempts to expel him from Charles University. The incident went to the emperor in Vienna himself. Masaryk had to wait 14 years before he was promoted to full professor, and this was significantly associated with his income. The climax was a public trial, fully documented by the newspapers, which ended in Masaryk's exclusion from the nation. Masaryk became the most hated man in the country. At the time, Charlotte gave birth to their son John. She had help at home from Masaryk's mother, who died shortly after the scandal. Yet Masaryk stepped up to another difficult encounter, the Hilsner trial. But just what did this trial entail? It involved the death of a 19-year-old girl who was found in the woods near one village. There was no blood under the victim's body, which raised suspicions and led some to believe it had been a ritual murder. Some believed it had been committed by a Jew in order to use the blood of a Christian virgin to prepare matzo. A Jewish man named Leopold Hilsner was accused of the crime. There was anti-Semitic sentiment all over Europe. In France, there was a similar trial with the Jewish officer Dreyfus. In Ukraine, there were pogroms. The centuries-old grudge of the Catholics against the Jewish people had manifested in an atmosphere of tension and hate. Masaryk was alarmed by an article written by a Catholic bishop titled simply, "The Blood." Dangerous prejudice and suspicious circumstances prompted Masaryk to go to the crime scene to check for irregularities. The murdered girl had probably been transferred to the woods after the murder. Masaryk saw this ritual superstition as an attack on reason. The moment he stepped foot on the case, though, he unleashed a media frenzy. Instead of substantiated arguments, opponents attacked his character. "Masaryk is working for the Jews! He got 300,000 gold coins from the Israelites!" The newspapers printed hateful caricatures of him. Masaryk received many anonymous threatening letters. Crowds of people gathered below the windows of Masaryk's apartment. These demonstrations were attended by those which Masaryk counted on most, his students. When he went to teach his lectures, 1,200 students stood waiting for him in the university courtyard with sticks and shouts of "Shame! Die!" Masaryk entered the auditorium and tried to address the crowd peacefully from the stage. "I was not afraid to come. I ask you, therefore, to hear me out." He tried to write out his side of the story on the blackboard, but quickly realized that the audience would not allow it. Outside, he saw that the crowd had started to attack his wife, Charlotte. It was at that moment that he decided, "We pack our things and go away from here, as far as possible, to America." But Charlotte stopped him, saying that they shouldn't retreat before they set things right. As Masaryk knew that the furious crowds were capable of committing anything, he got a gun license and a revolver. When he was asked by journalists how he was coping with the hunt, he said, "As if it rains, expand your umbrella and go on." The third great conflict, which has since been slightly concealed, occurred with Catholic prelates when Pope Pius IX proclaimed his infallibility. The professors were made to swear on the Immaculate Conception not only of Jesus Christ, but also on the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary. These actions pushed Masaryk to secede from the Catholic Church. He gravitated to the Protestant faith, but soon found that this conversion didn't suit him either. He found that the Church, like many other institutions, tends to worship and divinize itself. Priests declared themselves the chosen ones and surrounded themselves with a series of privileged dogmas. Thus, religion gradually transformed into ritualism, and the Church became a sort of cushion for state power. The altar and the throne mutually support one another. He worked out that it would be best for the religion to unchurch, meaning everyone could become pope to himself and associate with God without an intermediary. This attitude reflected an effort to democratize society. His motto was, "What can't I recognize with by reason that I could not recognize by faith?" Clericals eventually filed several lawsuits against Masaryk. In one such case, he was accused of insulting the priesthood because he had defended one of his fellow professors. Said professor had been denounced by a priest and was transferred to the countryside, thus ending his career. Masaryk was indicted for saying that the catechist who did this was not a minister of religion, but actually an informer paid by the state. And he was accused not by one, not 3, not 30, but by 308 priests. They demanded that Masaryk be exemplarily punished and to pay all court costs for each of the 308 cases. Because Masaryk had proven the legitimacy of his claim, the Catholic community moved on to their next campaign, even more serious than the last. The new campaign was forced by the highest ecclesiastical hierarchy and was supervised by the Emperor Franz Joseph. Masaryk was accused of intrusion on religion. It was proposed that he be relieved of his professorship and expelled from all Austro-Hungarian universities. When his lawyer handed him the indictment, with its 220 pages, his hands were shaking. Masaryk said, "Don't worry, I won't starve. If the worst should happen, we will move to America and bake pies and cakes." Fortunately, the presiding judge was a rational man and liberated Masaryk. The trial had gained massive public attention, and outside the court there were crowds waiting. The victorious Masaryk was greeted with applause. At the time, discussions were being held on the constitutional settlement of the monarchy. Czech politicians tried to equalize at least the language, to acknowledge Czech language as the official language of the Czech lands besides German. Czech Germans immediately objected. Not only did they object to the language equalizing, they proposed that the border territories of the Czech kingdom, which they called Deutsche Bohème, became an independent province. Thus, the integrity of the Czech lands was once again placed in danger. A few decades later, Hitler succeeded with it and tore away the borderlands. Masaryk strongly opposed this plan to dissolve the Czech state. He proclaimed that no nation is superior or chosen, and that the German nationalists have no right to do this. He said that the extinction of a nation, however small, would be a loss for humanity. He recognized that the pan-Germanization movement present in the plan would eventually lead to the horror of the First and Second World Wars. Masaryk watched as the Austrian monarchy slowly devolved into a servant and the vassal of Wilhelm's Prussia. Therefore, he asked a basic question: should the Czech nation continue to seek patronage in Austria? He realized that the problem of the small Czech nation was primarily a problem of the non-free nation. If the Czechs were to join the European nations as equals, they would have to elevate their status and prove to the world that they are beneficial and needed. He argued that a small nation should turn to humanism. This did not mean softness and appeasement. Humanity, of course, meant the right to resist violence and resist evil from the very beginning. It was a revolution of heads and hearts. To make politics reasonable and fair, to get rid of fear and servility, so that in the future there would be no slaves, but rather, on the contrary, a dynamic of, I am the master, you are the master. Not with violence, but with peace. Not with sword, but with plow. Not by blood, but by work. Not through death, but through life. That is the essence of Czech history and the heritage of our ancestors. His wife Charlotte claimed that if the Czechs were able to outrun the European Reformation by a century and spill blood in the name of freedom, then they would also be able to solve the social problems among the first nations in the world. She categorically asserted that whoever does not have a social conscience is a villain. It was at that time that she courageously joined the Social Democratic Organization and helped to hand out workers' newspapers and attend meetings and parades. Masaryk was one of the first in Bohemia who studied Marx and Engels. However, he did not find the answer he searched for in their works. He was not fascinated in the revolution or the violence. He considered it dangerous to declare workers the masters of society. He said, "There will always be someone who manages and someone who is managed. The point is that these two components assist one another because they need each other." Therefore, Masaryk formulated that the founders' question is a question for the capitalists too. They should work together to solve the problems of the world. Otherwise, disaster would follow, as was the case later in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution. He worked out an outline, a rather religious one in fact, that everyone should love his neighbor as himself. Masaryk was aware, however, that this was not a new idea, about 2,000 years old in fact, and had not been very effective, though he didn't know any other solution. As we mentioned, many rumors circulated about Masaryk and his wife Charlotte. People said, "She plays the socialist, but she employs maids." No one knew the real reason, and Masaryk never disclosed anything. The truth was that soon after the birth of their first child, Charlotte began to suffer from depression, and it became necessary to hire a maid to take care of the household. Masaryk discovered that the same manic depression sometimes occurred in their children, namely in his daughter Alice and his son John. John was not an easy boy to raise. It seems he revolted a bit against the Puritan atmosphere of his family. His father decided to send him, without funds, to America. John, future Minister of Foreign Affairs, was forced to support himself as a messenger in New York, and later worked in a steel mill in Bridgeport as a laborer. When the Austrian monarchy adopted a general electoral law and arranged elections, Masaryk founded his party, called Realistic. It was small, so he could only send 2 candidates to the elections, but its influence was extraordinary. Masaryk chose a rural district for his election precinct. He visited every corner of this region by train, car, or bike, and organized around 80 electoral meetings, which were held mostly in smoky pubs and sometimes stretched until 4 a.m. in the morning. Because these meetings were often dramatic, he sent a daily telegram to Charlotte, assuring her that he was okay. His opponent was the owner of a funeral house, a clerical, so it was not surprising that the electoral struggle took the form of a confessional confrontation. The Catholic Church issued leaflets against Masaryk in which they wrote, "He who loves his faith resents Masaryk. Who believes in Christ won't give his vote to Masaryk. The first round ended in a tie. For the second round, the workers decided to withdraw their Social Democratic candidate and voted for Masaryk, which caused him to win. Now when Masaryk entered the Viennese parliament, he was definitely not an amateur, but rather a perfectly prepared political professional who had come to represent the nation, which had gradually managed to build the monarchy's industrial and breadbasket core. Czech self-confidence had grown so much that Masaryk could demand equal rights and equal power. The Emperor Franz Joseph had to greet the new members of parliament, despite not liking the parliamentary system. When he approached Masaryk, he said with offended disbelief, "So it's you, that Masaryk." The emperor did not shake his hand, but turned his back and walked away. Masaryk then turned on his heel, and ignoring the apostolic majesty, he left the ceremony. Everyone froze in disbelief. In the Viennese parliament, Masaryk sought to modernize the monarchy, reforming it to the Austrian Federation of Equal Nations. He focused not only on Czech problems, but the problems of the entire empire. For example, budgeting or matters of education, which were close to his heart as a professor. His authority was constantly increasing, especially after he had saved 53 accused, alleged Balkan conspirators in a staged trial for certain death. After this sincere good deed, he was offered the presidential seat in parliament. Later, he was even offered a ministerial chair, but Masaryk refused. He had finally come to the conclusion that the Austrian monarchy was irreformable, that it only trivialized the vast problems, diminishing them, postponing, and not solving them. The monarchy was some kind of dusk realm, and in accordance with the statement of the German Emperor Wilhelm, seemed to soon fall like a ripe plum into the lap of Prussia. In his last appearance in Parliament, Masaryk used the analogy in which he likened the Habsburg monarchy to an unfortunate one who accidentally swallows an umbrella and is now obsessed with the fear that it could open, so he rather prefers not to move. Austria was doomed to stagnate. It couldn't be helped. MP Masaryk decided to seek the existence of his nation outside the monarchy. He insisted that the Czechs take their future into their own hands. When Masaryk reached his 60th birthday, he said to his friends at the birthday celebration, "The foremost is yet to come," over which his opponents waved their hands. This is the line uttered by the silly knight Don Quixote. As the only member of the smallest party, he was completely isolated. The reality was more complex. He enjoyed a high reputation not only at home, but also abroad. He was already considered the living conscience of Central Europe, and as such was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. However, Masaryk never received this honor because the heir to the Austrian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, opposed it. Ferdinand was shot and killed sometime after in the Serbian city of Sarajevo. It was the assassination of the heir which sparked a retaliatory campaign that quickly escalated into the First World War. The Central Powers, led by Germany and Austria-Hungary, entered the war against the Allied powers, led by France, England, and Russia. The war meant total disaster for the Czechs' ongoing effort to gain equal rights. Everything that the Czechs had worked for over decades suddenly found itself in ruins. The Czechs were essentially demoted to an ethnic group that now lived under martial law. Masaryk watched as trains carried Czech recruits to war that was not theirs to fight. They were ordered to fight against France, Russia, and Serbia, which for decades had been friendly to the Czechs. They sang songs like, "We go to war, but we don't know why." The soldiers of Czech nationality began to rebel in large numbers and started to desert to the enemy. Executions followed shortly thereafter. Masaryk saw what the ordinary soldiers were doing, what we, their leaders, had been preaching. We should act like them. And even if we should fail in this battle, we have the moral obligation not to stand aside. The ultimate decision came from a series of consultations on the prospects of the Czech nation he had with leading politicians. Austrian Prime Minister Koreber had bluntly said that after the war is won, the Germans will put an end to the Czechs, and the matter will be harshly settled. This made Masaryk radically reconsider his stance. If he ever was for Austria, now he stood resolutely against it. Up until this point he had wanted reforms, but now he was leaning towards revolution. If he had ever acted defensively before, now he went on the offense. Knowing that at home a revolution would not be possible, due to the ever-present police and army control, he decided to exit the country. He negotiated cooperation with the people who would stay at home, and before Christmas 1914, he said goodbye to his family. From this time on, at almost 65 years old, he traveled ploddingly around the world. Masaryk drew on a map of how he imagined the future borders of the Czechoslovak state, and when he looked at that map, he must have felt like a dreamer and an adventurer. Only a few people knew about Czechs in the world. The concept of Czechoslovakia was an absolute abstraction. And although the Allied powers were at war with Austria-Hungary, they really wished to preserve the Austrian monarchy. After a series of unanswered proclamations, Masaryk decided on solo action. On July 6, 1915, the 500th anniversary of the burning of Jan Hus, he gave a speech in Geneva, Switzerland, which announced the launch of the Czechoslovak resistance. If we keep passivity, we lose respect not only of Europe, but also of ourselves. Even a dog strikes back if he's being beaten. He was joined by two of his former students, the Czech Edvard Beneš, who later became the second president, and Slovak Milan Štefanik. Together they developed a program. First, we will try to integrate all expatriate organizations operating abroad. Second, we will develop an extensive publicity campaign to familiarize the world with the requirement of the establishment of Czechoslovakia. And third, we need to build the Czechoslovak army in France, Italy, and especially in Russia. If these legions enter into combat as a concentrated act, we will be taken seriously by the Allied powers. Back in Bohemia, there were 106 former Czech MPs, though Masaryk worked in exile alone. At home in the Masaryk household, hell had broken loose. The police were carrying out a series of raids on his house. His wife, Charlotte, was often subpoenaed for interrogation. Their mail was held back. Authorities stripped Masaryk professorship and pay, and sentenced him as a traitor to death. His son John went to the front, where he was forced to fight for Austria. Their other son, Herbert, died tragically. The police arrested the wife of Edvard Beneš and held Masaryk's daughter Alice in prison. Spies were sent to Masaryk with an ultimatum. Either he give up the resistance, or his daughter will hang. So Masaryk had gotten himself into a biblical situation, like Abraham, who had to sacrifice his own child. He thought hard about what to do and consulted it with Beneš. He even considered turning himself in, knowing that if he went back, he would be executed. Due to the pressure of the international public, the Austrian police backed down and released Alice from jail. His wife, Charlotte, who had lost all connection with her husband and had been left without means, fully dependent on the help of friends, spent months in solitude in her apartment. Her anxiety and depression had come back, and she ultimately succumbed psychologically. She had to be taken to a mental institution. The entire year of 1916 was black. The situation on the front lines had not developed well. Contact with the domestic resistance was still precarious, and despite dozens of articles abroad, lectures, and talks, their effect on helping the resistance was small. Austrian spies even tried to kill Masaryk. He began to develop sores and had to be operated on. Doctors found blood poisoning, which had probably originated from infected laundry. As treatment, his doctors prescribed horseback riding, as it helps to heal the body through breathing. On Masaryk's 66th birthday, he started riding. Until the beginning of 1917, Masaryk's resistance efforts had been focused in the West. He had watched the development in Russia from afar, though he was in no hurry to go there to see for himself. He knew that he was not liked by the Tsarist government. He visited Russia before the war and saw that the Russian monarchy had much in common with other forms of dictatorship. The Russian High Command did not support the idea of forming Czechoslovak military units from deserters. The Tsar himself even said that those who betrayed the Austrian Emperor would eventually betray him. But in February of that year, the Russian Revolution broke out and deposed the Tsar. Masaryk thought that it could be a crucial moment for the Czechoslovak effort. He wrote his last will and crossed the Northern Sea by boat, threatened by German submarines. He landed in Scandinavia and then took a train to St. Petersburg. He could not have known that at that time a German army wagon full of revolutionary conspirators was coming from the south. This group was led by none other than Lenin himself. In Russia, Masaryk was working to unite all expatriate organizations. The famous Battle of Zborov greatly helped him in his recruitment efforts. It was because during this battle the Czech formations fought brilliantly. The chief commander of the Russian army, Brusilov, worshipped Czech soldiers, and further recruitment was recommended directly by Prime Minister Kerensky. Masaryk visited most of the Czech units who had deserted the Austrian army, and in only a short time these units formed a new army, numbering between 80,000 and 100,000 soldiers. It was not entirely smooth sailing, though. Each soldier had experienced terrible things at the trenches as a member of the Austrian army, and none of them was keen on rushing back to similar conditions. Those who decided to join knew that if they fell captive again, it would be to Austria, and they would therefore be mercilessly executed as traitors.
To bolí, táto. Co to je? Český? Vy Čech?
Ano, já jsem Čech.
Miloši, pro Krista Pána. Co Ravas, jaký Miloš?
Ano, já jsem Miloš Ravas.
Fittwebel! Was sind? Schweinerei! Das ist ja doch eine Schweinerei! Fittwebel! Was sind Deserteur?
Furthermore, no one could guarantee the victory or creation of the Czechoslovak state. However, in October of that year, the Bolshevik Revolution broke out and reversed everything. This revolution was another setback for Masaryk. He was personally threatened and had witnessed the dangers of revolution firsthand in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kiev, with bullets whizzing past his head. But mainly he was shocked when the Bolshevik government concluded peace with Germany and Austria. First, the Eastern Front had collapsed, meaning that the Russians had stopped fighting, and the Czechs had to as well. Second, hundreds of thousands of German and Austrian former prisoners were being transported from Siberia to the west to reinforce the Western Front. And lastly, the Germans insisted that the army entities in Russia not be hostile towards any of the Central Powers, namely the Czechoslovak legions. Masaryk frantically sought an escape from Russia, a way to move the army to Western Europe, where the battle continued. It was not possible to exit through Romania, as complete chaos reigned there. Leaving through northern Russia, via the Arkhangelsk port, was also out of the question, as the polar ports froze and the North Sea was guarded by German submarines. So the only option was to transport the huge army across the world, across Russia and Japan, across the Pacific, across America, and across the Atlantic to France. Masaryk had originally planned to stay with the legions, to make sure the transport would be smooth, but he could not ignore the recent decisive development. The United States had finally entered the war. He realized that it would be America that would decide the war's outcome. He explained his strategy to the legionaries. "It's crucial for you to get to the Siberian Railroad as soon as possible, and then to the eastern ports. To avoid complications, you must maintain neutrality. I will go ahead alone to arrange transportation in Japan and America, and I will continue to work for the recognition of the independence of Czechoslovakia." He admitted frankly, "I cannot guarantee you victory." After 2 months of a miserable trek, he finally arrived to the United States. Meanwhile, on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, there had been an incident. The Czechoslovak soldiers, who were moving east, had met trains carrying German and Austrian soldiers heading west to strengthen the Western Front. The Bolsheviks gave preference to those trains, so the Czechoslovak legionaries were forced to sit in Chelyabinsk for some time. One German soldier on a passing train threw a piece of iron that fatally wounded one of the Czech soldiers. Czech legionaries stopped the train to take revenge on the assailant. The Czech command was then arrested by the Soviets, but they revolted. The principle of neutrality had been violated. There was a series of conflicts with the Red Powers, only exacerbated by the infamous telegram sent by Commissioner Trotsky, which ordered all Czech soldiers be disarmed. If the legionary refused, he would be shot on the spot. Legionaries took matters into their own hands, forcibly pushing across Russia through hostile territory towards the east. They made it an impressive 8,000 kilometers across the entire Siberian plain. During one combat mission, Czech legionaries seized the gold treasure of the Russian Empire, 28 wagons of gold. It was no surprise that the Czechoslovak legions made the front pages of the world press. Their journey had been described as the most famous and spectacular maneuver of the Great War. The legions became the subject of the Allied powers' considerations. They were eager to start intervention against the Bolsheviks and wanted to make the Czech legions the core of the operation. But nothing more was ever done on this matter. U.S. President Wilson received Masaryk on the 14th of June, 1918, but nothing came of the meeting. Along with the efforts to liberate Czechoslovakia and other subjugated European nations, Masaryk had been working on the terms and organization of their future coexistence. He negotiated the idea of a kind of United States of Europe. Then he was elected president of the European Democratic Union and signed the announcement of its creation in Philadelphia. Americans even lent the table George Washington had used to write the Declaration of Independence to commemorate this glorious occasion. Masaryk then wrote the Declaration of Independence of Czechoslovakia and sent it to the White House. He also sent the text to the press and raised the Czechoslovak flag over his seat. President Wilson supported Masaryk's declaration and on October 18th rejected a compromise offer from the new Austrian Emperor Charles. The Habsburg monarchy capitulated. At home, the Czechoslovak people assembled a coup, and on the 28th of December, 1918, a free and independent Czechoslovak republic was established. Some historians say that Masaryk broke up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is meant either as a criticism or an appreciation, but that's not accurate. Masaryk could not have done it alone. It was the disparate prison of the oppressed nations which led to the ultimate disintegration of the monarchy into a number of states. Masaryk evaluated the post-war situation positively. Before the war, 85% of people lived under the rule of feudal lords, but now the rules had reversed, and previous subjects now lived in democratic states. Across Europe, there was a belt of liberal countries, from Finland to Greece. They separated the once expansionist Germany and Russia, so now they could form a band of an integrated European Union. Masaryk added, "I wish God would give us 30 or 50 years of uninterrupted development, then I wouldn't be afraid of anything." Unfortunately, it would be only 20 years before World War II changed everything. Before Christmas 1918, Masaryk finally made it back to his homeland. After 4 years, he returned as head of state. After a welcome that had not been given to any emperor, and having taken the presidential oath, he immediately went to the institution where his wife Charlotte was hospitalized. Masaryk fulfilled the vision he believed in, but his wife had paid a price. He asked to put a table and chair in the next room, where he worked for hours. The door between them remained open, and from time to time he would walk over to Charlotte to assure her he would never leave her again. The first night Masaryk spent at the Prague castle, he couldn't sleep, not only out of a sense of responsibility for the new republic, but also because the castle was devastated. The Habsburgs had used it as a barracks for their artillery. Problems in the new republic arose immediately. Though all citizens of Czechoslovakia were constitutionally guaranteed equality, Czech Germans began to oppose. They dominated and ruled along with Austrians and had many privileges before the war. Now they were a minority, living mostly in the borderlands of their republic. The first signals indicated that politics in the new state would not be ideal. The economy had been devastated by the war. Money was worthless, hunger was everywhere, There was no tradition of self-governance, and there was chaos in neighboring countries. There was also a lack of men, and in every village in the country, monuments were being erected with dozens of names of fallen soldiers. The borders of the new state were unsecured. Masaryk naturally built on the fact that the territory of the Czech kingdom remained basically stable and unchanging for centuries. He tried to create a state where all its citizens were called for common work, including the Germans. So he invited them to parliament and even to the government. Our policy towards the Germans should not be vengeful, even if they committed sins against us before or during the war. Even as an old man, his presidential office was processing 65,000 submissions annually, handling 3,000 visits. On average, he personally attended to 400 audiences per year. He regularly went on trips around the country. People, who for centuries under foreign rulers often did not even know their ruler, now greeted their father, the liberator. He resisted in vain when they built statues of him on squares and named streets, schools, and all sorts of things after him. He considered himself simply a Platonic philosopher on the seat. He was a fundamental democrat who never abused his privileges and tried to educate people on true citizenship, leading by example. Masaryk pushed to make Jan Hus Day a national holiday, and the papal delegate immediately left Czechoslovakia in protest. Diplomatic relations with the Vatican were frozen for 2 years. The merciful and holy Church do not forgive, even after 500 years. As of today, 600 years later, the condemnation decree of the Council of Constance is still valid. The life and work of Masaryk flourished for a long time. When he looked at the first decade of his presidency, he stated that Czechoslovakia had joined the advanced states of Europe as a stable, mature democracy that went through a boom and strengthened its currency. Soon, though, the world economic crisis erupted. Masaryk was aware that the sharp rise in unemployment and poverty would lead to disastrous consequences. The economic crisis was accompanied by the rise of Hitlerism. Czechoslovakia gradually became a lonely island of democracy in Central Europe. Masaryk sensed that Hitler would unleash hell. He analyzed his manic, hour-long speeches and suffered many sleepless nights. At the age of 83, he responded with a unique sentence. "If I were being attacked personally, I would club the man with a brick, even if I had to rip it off the wall." However, as he got older, he began to weaken. In 1934, he suffered a stroke which paralyzed the right half of his body, disturbed his walking, hand action, and pronunciation. He resigned as president. The year of 1937 brought significant losses for the Republic. Significant leaders died, including former President Masaryk himself. His death was seen as a national tragedy. Writer Karl Čapek expressed his sentiments about Masaryk's death with a quote from the Bible. "Lord, stay with us, because the day is almost over." His funeral procession was almost 40 kilometers long. "The world has lost a hero," wrote the American newspapers. Writer Thomas Mann lamented, "If Europe had 3 or 4 people like Masaryk, its future would develop much better." Former Austrian President Professor Heinisch said, "Masaryk was the best European I've ever met." Playwright G.B. Shaw said, "If there were the United States of Europe, I could imagine only Masaryk as its president." Within a year of his death, the Munich Agreement tore apart Czechoslovakia, and the 3 Western powers gave the Republic to Nazi Germany. In the state of total dissolution that fell over the Czechs, the opponents again had a chance. Old hatred reached beyond the grave and blamed him. "Masaryk's concept has collapsed. His program has failed." Clericals also chipped in. "Masaryk bet on democracy and embezzled the Catholic tradition, because all power comes not from the people, but from God. In this state we have sinned. It is time to refute the Masaryk cult." The first bust of Masaryk was knocked down at the Philosophical Faculty in Prague. and people still argue about whether Masaryk was just a scientist or just a journalist, if he was an apostle or infidel, if he was a dreamer or perhaps a narcissist. His philosophy commanded him not to pray, but to act, not to sit with his head in his hands, not to just write considerations. Masaryk is significant because of his actions. The most important part of his legacy remains his moral personality, which was vibrant and inspiring. Thank you for watching.